Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a privilege and an honor, seriously, to be here with you guys today. The Mosaic family. Okay, I am starting to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Instead of, can you hear me now? I feel like now that we're doing all these Zoom conferences, I'm like, can you see me now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, yeah. All right. All right. So the title of my presentation today is A New Hope for Chicago, Stories of Hope and Transformation. We're going to be looking at some grassroots gospel efforts that are taking place in the predominantly African-American neighborhoods on Chicago's West Side, which is where I'm from, and looking at how they are responding to a convergence of crises that have been unfolding in their communities. But as my mom would say, we want to start off the way we plan to end up. So we're going to look here at Hebrews 11, chapter 11, verse 1. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So our hope is our telos, is our end, is the destination that our faith and our work is moving towards and pressing into. I put here my working definition of hope. Hope is a biblically informed expectation that God's transforming presence will break in and is breaking in to our reality. So here are the four predominantly and historically now African-American neighborhoods on Chicago's West Side: East and West Garfield Park. I was born and raised in East Garfield Park. I now live in West Humboldt Park, right across the street from the school where my husband teaches. Thankfully, he's a good teacher and his students like him, or else we would have some problems. North Lawndale and then Austin to the west. So these neighborhoods did not start off as Black neighborhoods, but through the process of the Great Migration, where you have Black families and individuals coming up from the South looking for opportunities during the early 1900s into the middle of the century. But then with the phenomenon of white flight following World War II, especially where white GIs and other white ethnic families were given federal housing loans and other subsidies to relocate to the suburbs that were being built at that time. Black families, including Black GIs, did not qualify for those loans. Instead, the Federal Housing Authority built the high-rise projects in Black communities in the city of Chicago and other cities across the nation in order to contain that population in a very limited space. So from the 1950s up until about 1968, which is the year that Dr. King was assassinated, that was kind of like the final nail that solidified this area as an all Black neighborhood. At that point, the remaining white families that were in the area left. So this area has been defined by redlining, which is a process of where banks refuse to invest in mortgages and other economic kind of investments in the area as the Black population increase. Suffer from job loss. For those of you who can still see my screen, here's a book called When Work Disappears, The World of the New Urban Poor. This was a groundbreaking study done by a sociologist named William Julius Wilson, where he talks about as white families were moving to the suburbs, so did all of the industry leave the city to the suburbs, where Black families, Black workers were really cut off geographically from even being able to work at those jobs. Suffer from long time disinvestment and generational poverty. To this day, the median income in East Garfield Park is $21,000. In West Garfield, $23,000, and North Lawndale, $26,000. In this book, if you have not read this, you have to. This is life homework assignment. It's called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, written by a lawyer, Michelle Alexander, where she chronicles and researches the war on drugs that began around the 1980s into the 1990s, and how that generated mass incarceration in Black and Brown communities. Here's a quote from that book, speaking specifically about these neighborhoods that I'm talking about today. she says fully 70% of men between the ages of 18 and 45 in the impoverished and overwhelmingly Black North Lawndale neighborhood on Chicago's West Side are ex-offenders. And part of what that means is that they are subject to all of the same discriminations that a Black man will be subject to during the Jim Crow South. So loss of voting rights, ineligibility to receive loans, whether it's student loans, housing loans, etc. So in this segment of the talk, I'm looking at some of the external factors that have helped to shape this space. Obviously, they're racialized factors, economic factors. One of them is the dismantling of the public housing that began here in Chicago under the Daley administration, the 1990s and early 2000s, which is cited as the largest removal of public and affordable housing in the history of forever. This happened as a part of the Clinton era Hope Project, Hope 6 project, I think it's ironically named, where they removed 220,000 units of public housing, but only replaced them with about 60 units of mixed income units. And so in a city like Chicago, many of the families were just displaced. Their housing was never rebuilt. And so spaces in my neighborhood just became increasingly crowded, and that intensified the gang drama and trauma that we were already experiencing. And I'll speak a little bit more to that in a minute. I'm fighting a cold, so as they say, y'all pray my strength in the Lord. This was a flyer was just passed out recently to some of our neighbors over the last couple of months, inciting people to leave their neighborhoods as there are new investment plans that the city is planning to redevelop this area. We call that gentrification, which is a process of demographic and economic change that comes to an area that ends up displacing and replacing current residents. So 10,000 families in our neighborhood were offered to live in to relocate to the suburbs if they would leave the places with they were living here in these neighborhoods. To the right of my screen, this was some really interesting research that is academic, and it was published in 2014, looking at the influence of this kind of gentrification on gang homicides in Chicago neighborhoods specifically between the years 1994 to 2005, where they found a statistically significant correlation between the housing demolition and the gentrification that comes from that and increased gang homicides. I've lived on the west side of Chicago my entire life, and I can tell you it has never been like this. It has been very traumatic, very intense place to live. In 2016 alone, we have 756 homicides in the city, mostly unsolved, and that increases when the victims are African American. Some last points here, of course, with the housing crisis of 2008, African-American neighborhoods across the nation, but in particular, these kind of neighborhoods were especially affected, where the few families that were property owners many lost their properties due to really inflated interest rates. So still kind of a up-to-date version of redlining that many of them experienced. All of these factors combined, over the last few decades, the city of Chicago has lost more than 350,000 African Americans out of the city, and 181,000 of those have left between the years 2000 and 2010. So we're losing African Americans in the city at very high rates. I just heard a talk on WGN about that. So it's coming from multiple sources. Finally, here under the Rahm Emanuel administration, we have the largest closure of public schools, again, ever, around 50 in this area, as well as on the south side. And our remaining flagship schools like Marshall High School and others, which conservatively had around 1,200 students apiece, now struggle to maintain an enrollment of 200 to 300 students. And this has transpired just within the last 10 years. As a final note about kind of the crises, convergence of crises, given the events of this summer, These are pictures that were taken in 1968 following Dr. King's assassination, some of the riots that were taking place here on Madison Street, which is our main business corridor. And it was never rebuilt. The city never allowed for investment to happen here in order to punish the people. As you can see, National Guardsmen standing there armed. And to speak in my West Side vernacular, this is a whole tank in the middle of the street, an army tank. And right here is Sunshine Cleaners. This is actually the cleaners that my dad went to when we were growing up. So just compounded trauma over the years. Here's some pictures that were taken from May and early June of last year in the aftermath of George Floyd's death on this same street. These were taken by a colleague of mine. So one of the questions that people were asking, how can people do this to their own neighborhood? And there are many different responses to that kind of a question. But part of the reality is that the families who live here have never owned here. So when I was growing up, many of these stores were owned by Korean families, more recent by Jordanian families. And many of the properties, the housing, were still owned by LLCs created by many of the white ethnic families that had left and have been known for being really poor landlords. And so there's just been a lot of compounded trauma. But God, and in the midst of it all, there are families who live here who love the West Side. It's just even in the way that we say it, the West Side, you know, there's just a love for this space, a love for this place. In spite of the trauma, in spite of the challenges, there's a strong sense of identity that people and the families that live here have with their neighborhood and with the West Side in general. And there is real vision that people have for themselves, for their neighbors, for their community, but just have really missed a lot of the opportunity and a lot of external support to help bring some of those visions into reality. So I have here, families want to see the West Side and the neighborhoods that comprise it as a place where they can flourish and thrive rather than just maintain and try to survive. So I want to show this video looking at some young Christian activists and what they're doing. I have to exit here because sometimes it don't want to act right. So y'all let me know if you can hear this, okay? Okay. Can y'all hear me? Somebody, Caroline?
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay, can you see the video?
Yes, go ahead and play it.
Okay, let me know if you can hear it.
This is my friend Kyle and I. We both graduated from Marshall High School way back in 2007. We shared an English class together where we would philosophize about our adolescent lives. Never would we have ever imagined the stands we'd have to take to protect this place and the community around it. In 2018, the Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POA organization, won a contest by submitting a design for the C40 Reinventing Cities competition. The C40 project is a green initiative in conjunction with the Paris Agreement, which addresses climate change. The organization comprises several global cities and develops strategic partnerships with the mayors of those cities. C40 Chicago, or Garfield Green Project, led by POA, has its sights set on 2 vacant lots for its proposed plant. Right across the street from Marshall High School on 5th and Kedzie in the heart of East Garfield Park, which has been a prime target for redevelopment that has led to displacement and replacement of legacy residents over the last 2 decades. Initially, there was no indication that the project would even lead to any actual development. The project had the full backing and support of former Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who notoriously made decisions that led to the divestment of Black and brown neighborhoods. Though concerned residents and activists requested that the aldermanic representatives of this West Side community put a halt on the project's development, we were assured that the project was nothing to be concerned about. While conducting a neighborhood petition, we discovered that 90% of residents in the footprint of the proposed site for development didn't even know what the C40 Garfield Green project was. And get this, earlier this year, A rep from POA admittedly shared that they had not gained any community input for the decision to build on said site and have only just recently put out flyers and pluggers detailing what the structure will look like and what it would supposedly add to the community. Not at all asking if any of the residents would like it to be built at all. According to the C40 Chicago's website, the $22 million project would entail 77 rental units, 9,000 square feet of retail space, 20,000 square feet of public open space, and a 12,000 square foot public plaza. 32 of the units would be made available at affordable rates, 31 as cooperative housing units, and 14 at market rates. The language around affordability this and other organizations use is vague and tend to base rates of affordability on the AMI, or area median income, which is between $50,000 and $80,000 in Garfield Park. However, 77% of families in Garfield Park make $30,000 or less. In fact, the local median income is approximately $21,000. A structure of this magnitude would greatly reshape the integrity of the surrounding neighborhood. An example would be how the hatchery, located on Lake Street and Sacramento Boulevard, has reshaped the area near the 3300 block of West Maypole. As a resident of the West Side myself, I am disgusted at the city of Chicago's willingness to drive development that leads to gentrification with little to no actual community input in the decision-making process. If this development is solely for the opportunity to transform select underutilized urban spaces into new beacons of sustainability and resiliency, then the stability, affordability, viability, and empowerment of community residents should be enforced just as importantly. We say all that to say this. We demand a fair process as legacy residents to be the majority deciding factor on what kind of development can come into our community. Give us an opportunity to come into ownership and provide us with safeguards that will protect residents from being displaced from the community we live in. To our aldermen, put a stop to all current development until the community's voice can really be heard.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Oh, you still
I'm still going. Yeah. Do I have a few more minutes? Okay.
Absolutely.
So just to clarify a couple of points from the video, the area median income, the 50 to 80,000 amount is looking at Chicago area broadly. And so when you see certain projects that have affordability, they're looking at the Chicagoland area as a whole and not the neighborhood area. And then the POA project increased its number of affordable units as well as added the cooperative units based on this organizing effort that was taking place right here, what you saw in the video. Out of that, a couple of grassroots initiatives have come up. The Garfield Park Coalition for Stability and Affordability, they asked me to write the charter document for it recently, which I did. And then the SAVE Alliance, which is an alliance of clergy people on the West Side. It stands for Stability, Affordability, Viability, and Empowerment. Connected to the SAVE Alliance has been this other effort. So part of what's happening is the pressure of displacement, but then also the pressure of the rising violence that correlates and corresponds to that. So out of a prayer meeting that was intergenerational prayer meeting where people were coming together to deal with the violence that was happening, a couple of the older women in that prayer have been studying the story of Rahab, and they felt inspired by that story as a story of hope and intervention. And so they asked the young people who were present if they would kind of get behind this idea of a campaign of going door to door and sharing these placards that they created, asking families to pray for God's intervention for their families and their blocks. And so they have been doing that. Over the course of the last 2 years, there are 480 families that are praying weekly for God's shalom to be evidenced on their blocks. Some gather in their homes, others get together with their neighbors on their blocks and do other projects like beautification projects, etc. There are weekly prayer texts that are sent out to all 480 families that include prayer requests as well as praise reports. They conduct monthly family empowerment trainings that cover different topics that are important to increasing the stability of families within the community. Scarlet Hope Initiative and the Save Alliance have been a crisis presence. Those of us who have been a part of that charter group, we've all been present at shootings. Many of us have either been on site, just waiting with guys as they've been shot, waiting for the ambulance to come, praying with them, praying with their families, or been called after the fact. And the Save Alliance has been building various partnerships with those who are trained specifically in addressing trauma. So here are some of the resources from my talk today. The New Jim Crow, which is mandatory human reading for people who live in America. Race and Place, How Urban Geography Shapes the Journey to Reconciliation. This is going to ground our discussion questions for today. Making Neighborhoods Whole. This is just a classic book on Christian community development. And then this right here, Between the Great Migration and the Growing Exodus, the UIC Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. They produced this report looking at the Black Exodus, but they have other reports as well. It's just very current research that's really relevant to what's happening in the city. And finally, this resource called Redlined, a memoir of race and change and fractured community in 1960 Chicago. This was written by a woman who was one of the part of the family that was one of the last white families to live in West Garfield Park before the neighborhood completely changed. And so she gives what she observed, the redlining, the other tactics that she saw happen as the neighborhood was changing. Okay, so here are my discussion questions. Caroline and Karina, do you want me to read these?
No, that's okay.
Okay,
That's fine.
Okay. Should I leave them up so that people can see?
Daniel normally posts them on the chat or pastes them on the chat, but that's fine too to give our audience an idea what the questions will be.
Okay, well, let me read these quotes because they're going to ground the questions. Is that okay?
Okay, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so this is from David's book where he writes, only by transgressing the socially constructed lines of racial division can we begin to reimagine places that cultivate human flourishing instead of strife. We are better able to do that by, one, better understanding the placed context of our racial division, meaning that our racial division doesn't just happen as we're going to and fro on our jobs, but it's embodied deeply in the very places that we live. And two, practicing ways of being a new kind of community that reshapes our cities and neighborhoods in the image of divine belonging. So these quotes will help to ground our discussion questions for today.